just want to see if Roy Sakoff is here. He's not. Okay. So I've had a terrific time this year, and thank you for having me. I sat in on one of Michael Shapiro's classes one day last fall where we brainstormed ideas for Brooklyn Inc. And I remember one of the students asking me, with all the press about newspapers and magazines going out of business, if I thought there would still be a job available for her by the time she graduated. I assured her there would be, that yes, the business of journalism was certainly in a state of flux, but that didn't mean she would have nowhere to go. But her question hit home, and I thought of my own two children and how hard it is and how anxiety-provoking it can be looking for a job. Since that class, it seems that I've had that same conversation with different students every day. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the state of print journalism today and how we got here and how we are going to get out of here. And within that discussion, there may even be some ideas on where to find the best jobs. To underscore the importance of this issue, just a few days ago, as you know, the Pulitzer Prizes were awarded, and the New York Times won 5, including one for Best Investigative Reporting and one for Breaking News Reporting. Few things are more important in the world of journalism than to assure that the New York Times and other great institutions not only survive, but also flourish, so they keep producing great quality news. There is no reason why they can't succeed. They do not have to compromise their journalism, even as their business model evolves inevitably to digital. I want to make one thing clear. Anyone who whispers or says out loud that the future of journalism is in doubt could not be more wrong. I am really excited and optimistic about its future. Here's why. In short, there are more readers of news than ever before, and that number is growing every year. We've only just begun to explore the countless areas where news will be expanded and democratized online. There is and will be more and more content to choose from and more ways to choose it. We can access almost limitless commentary and expert analysis within minutes of important events. Journalists can reach unlimited readers all around the world, and they can engage and debate with no technological barrier. Journalism isn't in jeopardy. It's just in another transition to a new and better place. And as long as the public puts a premium on quality information and analysis, and the public always will, journalism will survive and thrive. A lot of what we're seeing online today is actually a return, as Nick said, full circle to the way things were when American newspapers began. A mixture of advocacy and investigative, in-your-face journalism. There's a long and distinguished history of such newspapers, from the papers that were fiercely loyal to Jefferson or Hamilton, to the abolitionist broadsheets, to the activist newspapers at the turn of the century. As my partner Ariana says, the mission of journalism has always been truth-seeking, not striking some fictitious balance between two sides. And anyway, who can doubt that it's always been important to give consumers what they want? The truth is, the delivery system is changing, but there are aspects of journalism that have remained constant over time. That said, it's impossible to ignore the transition we're in today. You can't pick up a newspaper or read a blog without finding a story about the mounting troubles that have overtaken the print world. And by the way, not just the print world has been affected. We're all very familiar with the sweeping changes that are reshaping the broadcast news as well. But today I'll stay focused on print and on newspapers more specifically. And while no one knows what the future will look like, I'm confident that within a few years, tops, the news landscape will look fundamentally different from what it looks like today, with many new players, with some new leaders, but still totally fulfilling its vital purpose. The truth is that the market changes we are now seeing have been inevitable for years and quite obvious. But the financial crisis of the last year has greatly accelerated the scope and pace of change and is threatening the survival of American institutions that have outlasted panics, depressions, and both world wars. The Rocky Mountain News and the Seattle Post, Intelligencer, both founded during Abraham Lincoln's lifetime, folded this year. The Tribune Company, which owns the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, and 5 other daily papers, declared bankruptcy last December. And early this month, the New York Times threatened to close the Boston Globe, one of the defining papers in America, if management can't get union concessions. And even papers that seem safe for now have instituted massive spending cuts. Printed dailies are becoming slimmer, and so are the staffs that create them. In a belated, almost desperate effort to adapt, publishers everywhere are trimming costs and closing production plants. Meanwhile, internet news, including some of the online versions of the papers themselves, continue to gain readers while opening real new pathways of information. Not surprisingly, we're now in the midst of an industry-wide debate over what all this means for the future of news. Virtually everyone with a stake in journalism has weighed in. Some fear that journalism will vanish if papers no longer hit the doorstep. Others say that the delivery medium is meaningless. They don't care if news is printed or not, as long as quality content remains. But the future of journalism is not dependent upon the future of newspapers. And as all this is debated back and forth, that's very important to remember. The news business now faces real practical questions about how to pay for digital content and how to preserve standards online. But beyond these logistical challenges, we have to ask whether printed newspapers can remain relevant, or whether they're becoming anachronisms, like paper checks and fax machines. And if digital news is the future, how much of the old system can we or should we preserve? There are no perfect answers to these questions, and they are very difficult choices to be made. But at this point, we have to see the world as it is and not kid ourselves. So before we deal with these questions, how did we get to this point? Figuring out how we got here may help us get out of here. It would be easy for traditional newspapers to blame their present distress on the economic turbulence of the last 9 months, and some are doing just that, but that would be wrong. The changes that have been moving across the business for over a decade are far too big for that. We need to look beyond the current headlines to the time before the economic downturn, before the housing bubble, before Google, before Twitter, before George W. Bush. After all, the internet hasn't been lurking under our radar all these years. It's been exploding all around us. There were clear and present danger signs that presaged this time of change. By the time Craigslist appeared in 1995, AOL and Internet Explorer had already made internet usage common and easy. Sure, it was slow, and you had to pay by the minute, but the internet had an undeniable and unstoppable presence by the mid-1990s. It was powerful enough that in 1998, the Lewinsky scandal broke online, prompting a CNN reporter to complain that in the internet age, a 30-year-old former CBS gift shop clerk can wield nearly as much power as the editor of the New York Times. While he didn't mean this as a compliment, his comment did underscore a too often ignored truth about internet news, one that has been proven many times since. Web reporting is not a sideshow to print journalism. It breaks and creates important news. This was a decade ago, 1 year since Google, 2 years since Slate, but the internet's potential was already clear. By this time, we were reading more and more about the growing blog phenomenon. Newspaper circulation began a downward trend that hasn't stopped since. The pieces may not have come together yet, but they were surely lining up. As new technologies appeared, it was never a question of if they would evolve, but when. Once we had the laptop, it was only a matter of time until we had the BlackBerry, then the Kindle, Wi-Fi got better, computers got faster, The internet kept growing. News blogs like Andrew Sullivan's Daily Dish built large and loyal followings. Aggregators like Google News let readers find stories from across the web and not just in the major outlets. Sites like YouTube let people get involved, and Facebook and MySpace led the industry in building huge online communities. This all happened over the last 10 years. At that time, it wasn't totally obvious that these developments would change the news business forever, but it was clearly where the consumer was going. And of course, they did go there in huge numbers. Newspapers made token attempts to adapt, but they never reformed their business model in the transformative way that would have been required for the inevitable shift online. So why didn't newspapers see the signs? Why didn't they foresee or react to what was happening when their next generation of readers, including their own children, became so plugged into the internet? Even if they couldn't envision the exact shape of tomorrow, it was clear that it wouldn't be a repeat of yesterday. It was obvious that the old assumptions wouldn't hold for much longer. Part of the problem was that these assumptions were embedded into huge corporate structures that weren't built for sharp turns. Years of media consolidation created a handful of conglomerates that now control enormous swaths of the media market. Some, like Disney, GE, Viacom, and Time Warner, have bought all types of media, from magazines and TV to movies and books. Newspaper companies followed the lead and expanded as well. News Corp, Hearst, and the New York Times Company now own over 200 newspapers between them. This vertical integration left them with far less competition, so they were able to grow without innovation, but they also lost perspective. They doubled down on a business plan that seems to work short-term and then stifle creativity by barricading themselves in a corporate echo chamber. So they kept expanding their control in the analog world, even while the digital world was on the rise. It's not that newspaper owners simply ignored the internet. They were paralyzed by their apparent success. While threats to their industry dominance was clear on the horizon, for most of this time their business model seemed fundamentally sound. It wasn't the first time something like this happened, and it won't be the last. In 1978, the Casio company revolutionized the typing industry by inventing the electric typewriter, complete with text memory. But why didn't it enter the computer market with the force of companies like Apple? Or have you ever wondered why Price's patent Candles Limited didn't become GE? The history of business is a succession of innovations that have toppled industry leaders again and again. Clayton Christensen calls this the Innovators Dilemma. The problem he describes is that the best companies in any industry will eventually lose market dominance by doing everything that a good business should do. By the way, if I were in charge of Columbia University, I would make this required reading for every incoming student. Good businesses listen to their customers, they give them what they want, and because of this, they ultimately fail. Customers are no better at seeing the future than corporations. And if something doesn't exist yet, they rarely know that they might want it someday. For years, newspapers made market decisions based on a specific set of values derived from customer preferences and expectations. So these companies invested in making sure that their papers were delivered on time, that they had features and magazines, and that ink smudged less. Trivial as that may have seemed at the time, these were the choices that brought us here today. While newspaper publishers invested in creating a product with their qualities their loyal customers cared about, they ignored the things that subscribers apparently didn't value and certainly didn't demand. Breaking news at the instant it occurred. No one expected the papers to deliver a new copy to their home, no matter how big the story. Longtime readers also never expressed much interest in engaging in their news or debating other readers in a public forum. Letters to the editor were late and little more than a tired afterthought. So even though the internet made revolutionary advances possible, newspaper publishers saw little incentive to pursue major changes. Why establish an internet presence when almost none of their customers were asking for it? The internet had a small reader base, one that couldn't provide nearly as much revenue as the printed products buyers. Why should journalistic giants enter a nascent market with such little payoff? And this really was the essential problem. Traditional media outlets could have developed the online market. They were large, successful businesses. They had the resources to devote to the business if they wanted to. But they concluded that because most of their customers weren't asking for it, they didn't have to do it. They lived with this conclusion until it was too late. For too long, they complacently relied on the mantra, "Who wants to read it on a screen?" Digital news was a classic case of what Christensen terms a disruptive technology, a development that mainstream consumers aren't interested in at first. Whatever their assets, these innovations have too many downsides, or so it seems. In this case, internet news wasn't as professional as print media. It wasn't very portable, and there wasn't very much of it. And of course, you had to read it on the screen. No one will ever do that. But like other disruptive technologies, the internet also had some new and potentially transformative assets. Online news was cheaper, it was more up to date, and technology predictably made internet transmission more convenient. While newspapers, comforted by the knowledge that they were satisfying their customers' demands, ignored the internet's potential strengths, new and smaller companies emerged to exploit these possibilities. As the professionalism of internet news improved, the technology's other assets became more and more appealing to mainstream consumers. Reading the day's stories online became a viable alternative to buying a newspaper, and then it was only a short step to where newspapers find themselves today. When a disruptive change occurs in an industry, the companies that are first to innovate dominate the market. And because print newspapers waited too long to meaningfully move online, they left an opening for other enterprises to take over the provision of internet news. By the time this technology became commonplace, it was already too late for most traditional news outlets to catch up. So it's not that newspapers didn't notice the internet, and it's not that they didn't hold to their original business model because they were stupid or lazy or because they had some sort of pathological aversion to technology. Newspapers are in trouble now because, ironically, they were very well run for the world that was, not for the world that was coming to be. Newspapers aren't in the position they're in today solely because of the Innovators Dilemma. Even as they've tried to move online, they've had trouble adopting for several key reasons. First, efficiency standards have changed. Many newspapers tried to transfer their long-standing value systems, those that work in the print industry, to the internet. This is one of the primary reasons that they can't compete against other online news sources. A website can generate traffic by providing compelling analysis, even if only a handful of people are producing it. Compare that to the Los Angeles Times, which has 600 people in its newsroom. To make this number of journalists relatively profitable in the internet age, the Times would have to generate 600 times more traffic than the site made by one competent and devoted blogger. Sometimes this ratio holds, but it often doesn't. So a specialized online news source can provide content more efficiently. It can survive while taking in much less revenue. Increased competition is the second reason that newspapers have trouble online. Their business model was never perfect, but historically they succeeded by establishing monopolies or oligopolies in local markets. Since one or two papers tended to dominate certain areas, the advertisers had no choice but to pay high prices to reach consumers. In contrast, readers on the internet constantly travel among many sites, making monopoly impossible and making it equally impossible to charge high rates for internet ads. In addition, and very importantly, websites like Craigslist and eBay also dramatically impacted the newspaper industry by destroying the market for paid classified ads. Warren Buffett has said that newspapers are in trouble partly because few businesses get better with more competitors. And in the case of newspapers, which base their entire cost structure on monopoly pricing, the rise of competition has made their business model obsolete. The changing news cycle is the third factor. It's much faster now, and it runs 24 hours a day. Readers have come to expect that information will be continually updated and constantly available. Print newspapers are inherently unable to adapt to this demand. Print newspapers, consider what happened, for example, on July 7, 2005. On that morning, bombs exploded in several London subway stations. It was a traumatic and shocking event. And the New York Times did feature London on the front page that morning. But the headline read, "London wins 2012 Olympics." The subway bombings occurred at 9 a.m. London time, 4 a.m. in New York. Most editions of the paper had already gone to bed, and so the front page story was out of date even before it hit the newsstands and the doorsteps that day. The Times sets a high standard for journalism, so I'm not singling them out. This simply serves to demonstrate the fundamental shift in our notions of when and how news should be available. Four main factors got us here tonight then: the Innovators Dilemma, increased competition, a changing news cycle, and a new model of online efficiency. Add to that the current economic crisis, and welcome to the perfect storm. It's important to remember that while the financial downturn may have accelerated these factors, they were all in motion long before the housing bubble burst. Many of the changes we're seeing now have been both obvious and inevitable for years. Newspapers could have taken the time to gradually adjust to this new area of journalism, but now that opportunity is lost. In today's economic climate, newspapers have to find a way to adapt, and they'll have to do it fast. So now what? How do we get out of here? Jack Welch said that to succeed, you have to face reality as it is, not as it was or as you wish it were. That's perfect advice to the newspaper industry. The reality is, in short, that newspapers followed their longtime customers down the rabbit hole and lost track of their future readers. They are scrambling to adapt, and everyone has a different idea about how to fix the problem. I know for sure that no one idea is perfect, and no single idea will work instantly. This will be a difficult process that newspapers should have started for real years ago. That said, it's still doable if newspaper owners move away from their legacy business model and if they follow what their consumers have come to want and expect from the internet. As a starting point, I think that online newspapers need to think of themselves as technology companies as much as media companies. They need to recognize that new technologies have changed the culture of news and that online readers want engagement instead of passive delivery. There is also the internet culture and the economy of linking online, a culture that newspapers need to accept and see as an opportunity. A friend of mine at MTV said to me a few years ago, "Ubiquity is the new exclusivity." That means that news outlets need to get their content out there in as many places as they can. I think that accepting these facts will be an important step, but I also want to share what other people think. So here's a partial list of the ideas that are out there. Some of them are good and workable in my view, and some are not so good, but you should decide for yourselves. 1, build walled gardens. Don't allow others to link to your content. Build a big wall around your content and charge for it. That will show them. 2, give print newspapers tax subsidies. The Nation magazine recently published a proposal to subsidize newspapers. In this scenario, every person who subscribed to a newspaper for a whole year would receive a $200 tax deduction. The government would do this to direct money to print news without influencing content or picking winners and losers among print outlets. 3, hyper specialization. Some have argued that we don't need big news organizations. Instead, they envision a journalistic community that is made up of many small outlets that each specialize in one small area of news. By embracing this specialization, some believe that news outlets can become much more efficient. 4, establish a gatekeeper for all the content on the web. In order to get most content that's on the web, consumers would have to pay a middleman for access. 5, micropayments. This idea has some fans. Paper would sell news stories like songs are sold on iTunes. Proponents contend that the readers will be happy to hand over small payments if websites find an easy enough system. 6, newspapers as aggregators. With this model, newspapers would essentially become only aggregators for online content, finding the best stories from across the web and offering a seal of approval for the credibility of anything they link to. 7, focus on analysis, not news gathering. Some say with so much free information available online, there's no reason that every paper needs to write its own version of the same story. Instead, by focusing on analysis, not news gathering, newspapers can produce unique content with far smaller staffs. 8, close down the presses today. As technologies like the Kindle become cheaper and better, it makes less and less sense to print the news. It already costs the New York Times twice as much to print and distribute its paper than it would to just send all of its yearly customers a free Kindle. So close the presses today. 9, foundation support. Investigative reporting could also be funded through not-for-profit foundations. Experienced freelance reporters as well as amateurs with compelling skills and ideas could apply to these funds for the support to pursue important stories. Everything produced would be open source, meaning that the stories could be posted on blogs or make the front page of the Times, and everyone would get them for free. And 10, another Washington bailout. I guess right now there's been a bailout for everything, and the Newspaper Revitalization Act would allow newspapers to operate as non-for-profits, if they choose, under a 501c3 status for educational purposes similar to public broadcasting. Newspapers would not be allowed to make political endorsements, but would be allowed to freely report on all issues, including political campaigns. Advertising and subscription revenue would be tax exempt, and contributions to support coverage or operations could be tax deductible. That's a pretty long list, and those are just some of the ideas out there. Some of these proposals are clearly better than others. Building walled gardens, especially in my view, would be a huge mistake. The internet economy is a linked one, and as Jeff Jarvis likes to say, newspapers need to acknowledge this and see that online news is different than print, and they need to adjust. The linked internet economy is here to stay. So how do I think we get out of here? If I owned a newspaper, I would move to a robust hybrid model very quickly. I would aggressively build out my online business, and I would start planning my future without the printing press. By responding to consumer demands for greater engagement, I would take advantage of the changes the internet has brought. I would open the door to citizen journalism and to small, local, investigative units like the ones we are seeing in many cities today. I don't mean to suggest that citizen reporters can replace the great work of journalists like Dexter Filkins or David Barstow of the Times, but if newspapers pursue these new ways of news gathering, it will help build their online community, and that will in turn attract more users, and that will make for a better business model. My bottom line advice is pretty straightforward. Embrace disruptive innovation. Continuing to resist it is to fail to understand what has happened in the last 15 years. It won't work, and more precious time will be wasted. Build out the print business model into a workable hybrid. Integrate online and do it fast, and encourage reporters to create and engage community and to draw citizen journalists for their stories. It's time the industry got comfortable with the idea that media today is a networked ecosystem. It's all about originating, aggregating, curating, linking, and spurring conversations. Why? Because users want it that way. For today's newspapers to compete, they will have to offer their readers more chances to engage and discuss, react, and interact. Build your own online brand. It's not hard. You can do it these days very quickly. And remember, ubiquity is the new exclusivity. The way for newspapers to be somewhere is to be everywhere. I want to stress again what I said to the student in Michael Shapiro's class many months ago. Journalism has a great future. It isn't going anywhere. Nothing could ever replace the invaluable role that journalists play in our society. As the internet grows, news will only improve, so become part of the future and jump in. The impact you can make today versus just a few short years ago by breaking a story online, by creating a blog that will make a difference, by starting a site from scratch, and being able to build a brand in 1 year is what it's all about. Thank you.
So we're going to take some questions for Ken. There have been some coming in via email, some on the Twitter feed right behind him. But if you have a question, you're also welcome to come up to the microphone. Please come. There are 2 microphones. Or you can also text the questions to that phone number up there. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Heaney, and I graduated in 1999. Journalism has changed so much since the days when I graduated and my class graduated. New media was for geeks. It was not the way forward in the year that I left the school. But journalism has changed so much. What do you feel is the future for an institution such as Columbia? Anyone can set up a blog. Anyone can set up their website. You don't need to go to a journalism school. So how can an institution such as Columbia survive in today's world?
Well, actually, I think Columbia has to move just like the New York Times has to move. And I think Columbia is moving from my experience this year. Victor Navasky, who's a professor here, told me that when Nick Lemon met with the professors and said that I was invited to teach here this year, he said, "I was amazed, Kenny, because no one booed." I guess no one booed. Where's Shri? No one booed. But in this last year alone, I think they've gone from 1 course to 8 courses, and next year more and more and more. So I think what the school has to do is realize where journalism is moving and move with it. That doesn't mean that you stop teaching the basics of journalism, because obviously you have to, but they have to realize what their students want and super serve their students. That's what I would do. I haven't discussed that with Nick though. Oh, were you standing up? Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Jerome Sherman, class of 2004. In the business model that you described for the newspaper, the business model that you described for a newspaper that you hypothetically would be running, how do you envision funding a large newsroom of reporters? For right now, for instance, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, I think, had something like 165 reporters, and now they're trying to be online, and they have about 20 reporters. So can you envision a business model that's online that could have, like the LA Times, 600 reporters? Is that possible, or are news organizations, are you going to, is it inevitable that there are going to be a lot of unemployed newspaper reporters?
It's inevitable that there are going to be a lot of unemployed newspaper reporters. Okay. But that's not really the answer to your question. I would love to be able to take an existing newspaper in a mid-sized city and morph it from a newspaper to a website and think that that's very doable. It's much more difficult when you start talking about the New York Times and the LA Times and the Washington Post, granted. But you have to begin somewhere. And the longer you wait, and the longer, as I said, you don't embrace the new technology, the more difficult it's going to be. So they've started. I don't think they've done enough. And I think they have to accelerate the changes that they're making. That's for the big papers. For the mid-sized cities, I actually think it's quite easy to do. So I don't have the opportunity to do it, though.
But do you think mid-sized, like I work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Uh-huh.
We have about just under 200 reporters now.
How many?
We have about 200 reporters, but in 2000, we had 300 reporters. And
Yeah.
we haven't had layoffs. It's all about buyouts or people leaving on their own to pursue other careers. And what I'm imagining is someday postgazette.com, is it inevitably going to be just 30 reporters? You know, is there a...
I don't think it has to be 30 reporters.
No?
I think clearly there has to be a transition. But if I owned, I probably shouldn't say this, but if I owned Time Magazine, what I would have done years ago is I would have hired X number of journalists when I was able to, and I would have said, it's your job, Group A, to put these guys out of business. And I literally would have had a competition. And I wouldn't have had them work together. I would have said, you break your stories and don't worry about the magazine. And that's what I would have done at Time Magazine as an example. It's harder with papers, the bigger they get, but you have to begin somewhere. And if you don't, you're going to go out of business more quickly than if you do.
My name is Mike Grimes. My wife is a journalist and sort of an old-fashioned journalist. When you start getting into blogging and you start getting into everybody has a voice on the internet, where do you draw the line of real journalism and somebody's opinion, and when does, you know, everybody wants to read, this is what they want to read, so is everybody then reading Us Magazine versus reading the New York Times? Where do you draw the line of, you know, what's real journalism and what's not anymore?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think that people will read what they want to read online and in newspaper. It's not, I wouldn't begin to know in this forum and talking to you how you draw. I wouldn't want to distinguish and say this is real journalism and this isn't. I mean, is a great blog real journalism? You can answer that question.
Well, but the fact of the matter is, what I understand is that when people go to school, they learn rules of journalism and rules of investigative reporting and things like that. And when you're reading a blog, you're basically reading somebody's opinion, and it has nothing to do with any of that.
I guess it depends what blog you're reading. But granted, some blogs have nothing to do with that, and other blogs have a lot to do with that. So, but I wouldn't begin to know how to answer what is real journalism unless we're talking about something specific. I'm not trying to duck your question, but it's too hypothetical for me to get my head around.
Hello, my name's Eleanor Hall. I'm from Australia, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I was a graduate here in 1989. I want to come back to the question of money. Fundamentally, I actually want to know whether you think there is a business model for online journalism, because...
For online journalism?
Yeah, because in Australia there's a site you probably heard of called Crikey.com.
Yeah.
And it was recently sold for $1 million, so someone made money out of it. But the guy who's running it now says there's no way that he could keep the site running if he wasn't actually using the existing newsrooms, which spend all that money funding journalists around the world, journalists in the political galleries, etc. Would you be able to survive if you weren't able to cannibalise the existing sort of quality journalism that's out there?
So those applause mean you could or you couldn't survive. I think the answer is yes, but I think you have to start slowly, and I think you have to build up. And internet advertising lags traffic by an enormous amount. There's a real delay in the system. But every year, that delay gets shorter. And in 2 years, or in 3 years, or in 4 years, internet advertising is going to catch up, and it's going to change. And I think then you'll see it really kicking in.
Do you turn a profit?
We have turned a profit in some months, and we haven't in other months. And that's because we're now in an investment mode. So when you have a startup and you decide to invest in something, then you don't turn a profit. But there have been many months that we have, and then there are months that we're not. It depends on how much we're reinvesting. But I know for sure that you can run an internet news site profitably if you have the right seed money and you don't try to do it all at once. For sure. I have no doubt about that.
Where does the money come from, this slow dripping internet advertising?
You know, it comes from advertising. It comes from, you can do email and get, and like a daily candy or something like that and make it part of your site. Those are really the only two avenues of revenue I know. If you know any more, let me know.
Here's a question that's come via text message. If the walled garden won't work, then why is Consumer Reports the only online media site making a decent profit?
You know, it works at the Wall Street Journal a little bit too, I'm told. So, but the walled garden for some specific sites, because they have a legacy, have worked. But I don't think, I'm looking at you, Shri, answering your question. I don't know why. You read it somewhere.
Yeah.
But the ecosystem, as I said, of the internet is a linked ecosystem, is a linked economy. And I remember working at AOL 12 or 15 years ago when everybody was writing about knock the walled garden down, and it was knocked down. And I think it is my view, I think it's completely impossible to construct a walled garden around the internet and it will have any other effect other than taking readers away from those companies online. People disagree with me, I know.
Hi, Bill Lichtenstein from class of '79. So much reporting these days still emanates from newspaper reporters. You know, the substantive reporting on the CIA or international affairs, and then it flows out over the internet, and people comment on it, whether we print it or they link to it. And same with TV news outlets like MSNBC or CNN, where you see Paul Krugman or other major reporters on TV talking about issues. With the newspaper industry like hanging on by its fingertips, like a hero in an action film, if newspapers do go under, can that infrastructure of reporting be replaced by the existing internet structure? And the other question is, given that the Huffington Post business model is not to pay its writers, and I understand the whole theory.
Is that what?
You not to pay freelance writers, is that correct?
Bloggers.
So I understand bloggers. And there's a business model there where people do it for the exposure they get and whatever. But is that a sustainable business model to be built on sort of people essentially donating their work for the sake of the exposure?
What was the first part of your question?
Without newspapers, would there be a flow of news through the system that would sustain journalism if newspapers went under?
Well, first of all newspapers aren't going to go under at all. So I don't agree with the premise of the question. And I don't think journalism, is going to go under at all. So there are going to be plenty. They may not be in print though, but there are going to be plenty of people. I think as many people. I think probably more people in the future now practicing journalism that will make for, as I said, a huge amount of content to fill all the online sites. So I don't think that's an issue. As for the bloggers on the Huffington Post, we don't pay them. That was our original business model. We started out with about 10, and now we probably have about 3,000. So it must be working for them, and it's working for the readers. So it seems like it makes sense to me. They're doing it for a reason.
I'm Father Carl D'Souza. I'm from the class of '69. I was teaching journalism for the government of President Nyerere in Tanzania. And I find that the newspapers, what you mentioned, newspapers are closing down. They're turning out to sensationalism to try and get a readership. And I've been in discussion with John Meacham of Newsweek because they're turning now that even if you mentioned Time Magazine has got a much leaner edition now. The last edition are very, very lean. And Newsweek has resorted now to discuss religion. They've gone to that. And I'd asked John Meacham, is that to get readership that people buy when you start controversy in religion? And in other words, are we moving from the trend of journalism, what we learned from 40 years ago about objective reporting, to now sensationalism and even very subjective reporting?
I remember that. I remember when the New York Times didn't have a business section and didn't have a sports section, and every story on the front page of the New York Times was basically about politics and international affairs. Shows how old I am. This was a long time ago. And then I remember all of a sudden that business started appearing on the front page of the New York Times. Well, I'm sorry. First they did their section. Then all of a sudden it started appearing on the front page of the New York Times once in a while. And then right now there's a business story on the front of the New York Times every day, probably has been for the last 10 years, 8 years. And I remember when sports was just put away in a closet, and now sports is covered every day and a lot of days on the front page of the New York Times. What I'm trying to say is that I think what's happened is the industry has morphed, and everything is now covered as sports or as entertainment, if you will. Not just on the internet, but in newspapers throughout the country and throughout the world. And that's here to stay. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't also spectacular great journalism being produced side by side. And it is, as we see through the Pulitzer Prizes every year and all the investigative stories that are coming out. But there's no question that everything today is now covered as sports or entertainment, regardless of the topic. You just have to look at a presidential campaign. That's here to stay. And you know, you can talk about the pyramid of journalism and everything you learn here, regardless of what the topic is. It's basically morphed, in my view, into covering everything almost the same way. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's a fact.
You used pretty interesting body language when you talked about sort of the way things are moving. The digital strategy seems to be moving.
You watch that TV show on Fox where they look at the eyes and they try to tell you what you're really thinking? Okay, go ahead.
So, newspapers clearly are struggling, you know, a variety of reasons for that. But if you look at the digital business strategy, maybe not at the moment, but maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, what weakness do you think you'd be concerned about in a digital business strategy for media and journalism?
I'm sorry.
So we're seeing weaknesses in the model for newspapers, traditional media.
Right.
And right now, we're talking a lot about a digital media strategy.
What are the issues that digital media would face?
Yes.
Well, one is advertising, because as I said before, there's a long lag, and it's really difficult to match your advertising with your traffic. So how long that takes, for me, is probably the crucial issue. And you know, when we first started the Huffington Post, I said to their head of advertising, I don't really want that ad in that same place all the time. Let's move it around like we move content around. Why does it have to be right there? And so we figured out a plan to move it around, and he came back to him and he said, this is like disaster. You can't do this. The advertising community won't go along with it. So there's a long way to go for the advertising community to figure out how to best advertise online. And you see it with video. Is it pre-roll? Is it post-roll? Is it underneath? How do you do it? So for me, that's the key issue. And it isn't a question of if, it's a question of how long. So if you start a company from scratch, your revenue goals should really be conservative, because it won't be what you think, even if your traffic outpaces your model. For me, that's the key issue.
And just a follow-up question. So we've got a pool of journalists now. Do you think under a new successful model, the same number of journalists would still be employable, or will really the pool of journalists have to shrink in order Or
I bet you there's a contraction and then an expansion, is what I think. That's my guess.
Ken, John Martin, I call myself a recovering journalist, and I teach here. I really want to thank you for a terrifically provocative and thoughtful analysis of this. We've all been trying to analyze it, and you've done a fabulous job. And
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by the Huffington Post. I'm also fascinated by this idea that you have about 3,000 bloggers who do it for their own purposes, their own ideas. Two questions. One, what percentage of your content comes from those bloggers, and what percent comes from reporting that you're doing? And is there an idea that someday you'll get reporters who are going to be reporting because they want to? And is that part of your business plan?
We publish about 250 unique blogs a week. So divide that into 7, and that's how many we publish a day. And we publish, we have 5 or 6 paid reporters in Washington, and we have an editorial staff of about 25, paid editorial staff of about 25. And we probably publish about probably more than a dozen stories a day out of the Washington Bureau. We've announced that we're starting an investigative fund, which we and others are committing about a little less than $2 million to the initial startup. And everyone who works for that as a paid or freelancer will be paid. And that will be published open source, same time on this new site we're launching as the Huffington Post and any other site that wants to take it. And our business model is to continue to hire reporters and editors and grow out the business and have much more robust original reporting as the numbers will allow us. And so we have a plan this year to expand considerably, and we have a plan in 2010 and 2011 to keep expanding the number of reporters we have, not just in politics, but across all the different verticals. So, but we're doing it as we can afford to do it, so we don't end up like the fax machine. And thank you for your comments.
Christy Nicholson, class of '07, and that was part of my question. I was at the South by Southwest Interactive Conference in Austin, and there was a lot of hallway conversations about the fact that some of your writers, and they were right there talking about how they've written for you for free, and there were others that were complaining about that and wondering, at what point will even the original, and this is original content, this isn't just, you're not just necessarily grabbing it, these are people that are writing original content for free, and I understand completely they're willing to do it.
Our bloggers.
Yeah, the bloggers.
Yeah.
And the people that I spoke to were good reporters. I mean, I consider there is a difference, I suppose, between bloggers and reporters, but these were people that I know, and I know they're writing, and I trust it. And so you are intending to wane out the amount of free online content that's high quality content.
No, I didn't say that.
No.
I didn't say that.
Well,
I said we were going to add another kind of content.
So you'll continue to do it as long as there is a market for it as well as a producer for it. But does that at all undermine the professional writer? And I guess this is the issue that we're all facing. Those who are willing to write for free because they're getting their name out, and I completely understand. I mean, hell, I'll be one of them. But I worry about it even, should I participate? I just don't know.
Well, I think it depends what you want to do, right, for yourself, and how you want to, I mean, it depends what you want to do for a living, what you do for a living.
Right.
We are able, when somebody blogs on our site, if they have their own site, to drive an awful lot of traffic to their site. Yeah. So you could, depending upon how big a site you had, then better monetize your site. You could help sell your book. You could help sell your ideas. You can go on cable television. You can help build your brand. So if I were a blogger, which I'm not, for a whole bunch of reasons, I blogged once or twice and people disagreed with me, and I said, I'm out of this business. I'm not blogging anymore. I didn't like the comments, so I get hurt feelings very easily, as my family will tell you. But there is a lot that blogging for the Huffington Post or blogging for somebody else, there's a lot that you can get out of it and extend your brand. So if I were a blogger and I wanted to make a business out of it, then I would blog for the Huffington Post or for somebody else, because that's going to help me build my brand. And at some point, if I'm good, I'm going to say, I don't need you anymore. I don't need the traffic, or I don't need this, or I don't need that.
So that's not. So it's not going to devalue writing.
I think not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
No, it's good. No, it's useful.
I mean, I don't think so in the least.
Yeah, and certainly for something that as high profile as the HuffPost, and like the fact that you've surpassed Boing Boing as the hottest blog in the world, yeah, then there's value.
Listen, when I was, I dropped out of college and I moved to New York, and you know, I worked in a political campaign, and then I decided I wanted to be a writer. So I did a freelance article for the Village Voice, and I did freelance for New York Magazine, and I was dying, right? I mean, what did I get paid? Not probably $200 for this amazing investigative piece that I thought I did at the Village Voice. And there was nowhere where I could go. So I'd go to this magazine, or I'd go to that magazine, and I'd go to this newspaper, and I'd try to get freelance assignments, and I couldn't get anything. Today, I could do so much more, it's not even funny, on the internet. I really could write and get it out there and show people how good or how bad I was. I was pretty bad. But if I was good, I could have made a living back then. I wouldn't be standing up here talking about what I'm talking about. I'd be writing for the New York Times. But I didn't have that opportunity.
Steve Gavoni, class of '84. Could you talk about the rationale for the Huffington Post adding a humor page, 23.6, and how it's doing, whether it's profitable?
Well, it's a vertical on our site, so we don't look at the verticals as profitable or unprofitable, because mostly our advertising is across the site, so we don't break out the numbers that way. We helped launch 23.6 for IAC about a year and a half ago, and then IAC decided that they were going to sell a lot of their smaller companies they started, and we were partners, so we were able to bring IAC into the Huffington Post. And we did it because we liked 23.6 a lot when it was independent. We thought we could drive much more traffic to it, which we've been very successful at that. Comedy is a very viral piece of content online, so we thought it would be viral, and it's really worked. We've got a lot of page views coming to it. It gets picked up, and it's really working. We have a lot of people who want to blog because they're funny, or they think they're funny, and it's a great outlet. So it's really working very, very well.
Follow-up, you mentioned aggregators earlier, which brought to mind pages like the New York Times Steelbook or Real Clear Politics. Can you elaborate on who's doing it well and how you see that evolving given the economic challenges?
I guess I don't want to talk about who I think is doing it well or not doing it well, but you know, the New York Times now has a Times Select, a Times Extra. Everybody know what that is? So the New York Times is now becoming an aggregator itself. And so you can click on the button of Times Extra, and it gives you a new, different front page of the New York Times, which then links out to all sorts of different sites, unrelated stories. So I think that's a good thing. I think the New York Times should do that more. So they are, in fact, becoming an aggregator. I don't know that it's helped their business model, but I think it's a move in the right direction. As to what specific blogs I like, I don't know. Nobody really cares. I'll tell you later.
But do you think the Times, though, is making money at that kind of aggregation model?
I don't think the Times is making money much right now. No. But I think they could, but I don't think they are now.
I mean, where I work, the Deal Book, which aggregates from the entire spectrum of financial and business journalism, is one of the most widely read.
Yeah, I love the Deal Book. I don't know how they sell the Deal Book. They probably sell it they probably, you can probably buy advertising on the deal book specifically, and but I have no idea of the economics of how they book it and what they book it against. That I don't know. But I know it's very well read, and I read it all the time, and I like it. But I don't have a clue of their economics. Sorry.
My question is about blogging has been mainstream for years now, and
not for too many years.
But we can comfortably say years now. Maybe some of us can. And
if years is 2, I agree with you.
And now that Obama, once he picked, he fielded a question from the Huffington Post, and there are bloggers who are asking world leaders questions at the G20. Do you think bloggers are getting their due? Is it something you even concern yourself with? What do you think?
What's the question?
The question is, blogging was a dirty word, and for a little bit, and people used to.
Blogging is no more of a dirty word,
right?
And I would say that when we started the Huffington Post, which was 4 years ago, it was in the category of "you got to be kidding me." That may not be a dirty word, but it was pretty close. I think it's very mainstream now, very mainstream, and very well accepted, and here to stay forever. And every day, I don't know how many more thousands of blogs are coming online, but I'm sure it's in the thousands.
120,000.
How many?
120,000.
A day? Oh my God.
What?
It's a lot of blogs.
A week or two ago, there was the Washington Post did a story about how foreign terrorist organizations were using the web hosting services in the U.S. And they started off their story by saying they did a short little vignette of basically how one blogger uncovered it, and that was they used that to start off their whole story, and they never linked out. There was never any mention of the blogger, and I'm just thinking if they used a piece of content like a photo, they would never use that without giving credit. And I just want to know, how are they still allowed in 2009? I mean, with bloggers.
I don't know that specific instance, but I think it's probably atypical. I think more and more bloggers are getting credit, and I don't have the time, but I could list off a whole bunch of very important stories that different bloggers have started, have continued covering, and have been responsible for breaking real significant news in this country.
The mention that he made of President Obama picking on a Huffington Post a reporter, and in fact that's the point, that I bet he thinks of himself as a reporter. He's a White House correspondent, Sam Stein.
Oh, he's a paid reporter.
Yeah, he's a paid reporter of the Huffington Post, an alum of the J School, by the way.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he doesn't think of himself as a blogger. He's a reporter.
No,
so
he's a paid journalist who covers the White House for us.
Here's a comment and a question from somebody. The journalism business model you've described seems to rely on two models of journalist. An entrepreneurial journalist who has to build a business model for himself or herself, and B, a hobbyist journalist who doesn't need to rely on it for an income. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Well, is that what you're saying?
Read it again.
No, that you've said, the question seems to be that you've said there are only two new models of journalist. An entrepreneur who has to build himself.
I disagree with, I didn't say that. He wasn't listening because he's not here.
No, this is someone they might be here. I don't know. I'm not going to call them out.
I didn't say that. I don't believe I described that there are only two new kinds of journalists.
Okay, and what about and then the second one being a hobbyist who doesn't really care for money or doesn't?
No, that person made that up. I didn't say either of those things.
If that person wants to speak up, they can.
I didn't say hobbyist once in this entire.
No, but they're implying that that's the vision you've laid out for the future.
Well, then I didn't communicate it properly. No one in this audience thinks I said that. Next question. It's 8:30.
Okay, last two questions.
Hi, Ken. My name's Allie Fenwick. I'm a current student. I was in your class as
yes.
well. Thanks.
Make it a nice question since you were my student.
Well, I'm vlogging today for free for my unpaid internship at portfolio.com.
Oh, good.
And so my question is about content that
The AP has recently kind of pushed back against aggregators, and it's about.
Oh, you're blogging about this for portfolio.
I'm blogging about you.
Uh-oh.
Portfolio. That's
Okay.
right. So.
Go ahead.
So I was just interested in what happens to places like the Huffington Post when I think Time Magazine had a piece that said the Huffington Post is going to get sued sooner or later. The AP is talking about fighting back against aggregators. How do you guys prepare for that scenario? What does that do to what you guys do every day?
Well, I don't agree with Time Magazine. I don't understand what AP. I don't understand the AP strategy. So I've thought about it a lot. I've read all the stories. I don't understand it. The Huffington Post pays AP a lot of money every year to carry their stories. So we're a licensee, and I think we have to wait to see what AP is really talking about, because I don't get it.
But does the Huffington Post have any kind of legal type of defense scenario?
We don't need
Plan
a
for the
defense
future?
scenario. There's a fair use doctrine which we follow. So there's nothing that the Huffington Post has to be defensive about in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
Make sure you quote that right. Or else you're going to get me in all sorts of trouble tomorrow.
Hi, my name's Rhiannon, and
Hi, Rhiannon.
I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what I guess I see as the rise of automated journalism, kind of like the New York Times is open API, how PolitiFact just won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's kind of a semi-automated database and reporting.
So would you put Dig in that category?
I'm not a big Dig user.
Would you
but
put Outside In that category? I'm just trying to figure out where you're going. Are you talking about sort of
I guess-
hyper-local or?
more of the rise of kind of a bigger role of computer programmers doing journalism, being journalists in a way, by bringing together just data that otherwise eludes us because there's too much of it, too many data feeds coming from city council, too much.
But are you, does an editor then sort through all that, or are you talking about taking that and sort of having the computer the technology make decisions and putting it on? So that's kind of like Outside In to some extent. I mean, it's kind of like hyperlocal information, right? I think that's what you're asking. I'm completely intrigued and obsessed with internet journalism from the bottom up, from the local level up. So there are two kinds of content. Arguably, there are more than two, but top down, which you might say the New York Times is brilliant at top down journalism. But then there's all incredibly interesting things going on from the bottom up, from the local level. And in investigative reporting, there's an enormous amount of activity in smaller cities where investigative units have been started, mostly by laid-off journalists that are really covering, in a very specific way, city councils and mayors and real estate issues and things like that. So I think that's a huge future for the internet and a huge future for the consumer. Right now, there's not a great business model that I've seen, and there's not for content, and there's not, although Outside In I think is terrific, and there's some other ones that are pretty good. They're my favorite. And there's not really an advertising model to support that, but there will be, and it's going to come together, and when it does, I think it's going to be a real transformative step for the internet, and I think about it all the time. I'm really very interested in that.
We'll wrap up with these questions. I know Ken will stick around for a while, so you can come up and talk to him directly.
Ken's getting old.
Two questions, and maybe you can answer them sort of together. But
okay.
If you were dean of the school, what would you mandate as a curriculum change to prepare beginning journalists and seasoned journalists who come back for a training here for the future? And then something that I learned from you was the importance of branding and how quickly brands are established online. And I'd love they're not connected questions, but maybe that could be a final thought for today, because that really inspired me, what you said
Well,
which we taught our students.
Okay, so I'll repeat what I said to the students about branding. Sri, I'm not familiar enough with the curriculum here to know, to even pretend that I could give advice as to how the curriculum should change. I know what I've done, and I, know a dozen professors here and know what they do, but I'm not competent to answer the first half of the question. The second half is I have this theory that that goes along that's like this, that says 30 years ago it took 30 years to build a brand. You quote me for Portfolio magazine on this. That 20 years ago it took, and think about it, and think of companies, and 20 years ago it took 20 years to build a brand, and 10 years ago it took 10 years to build a brand, and 5 years ago it took 5 years to build a brand, and today you can build a brand in a year. And if you think about that when you put your head down on the pillow tonight, it really is sort of true. Now, sure, you can argue with me and show me examples that don't fit that, but it really is true. And so the opportunity today where you can build a brand in a year is mind-boggling. And I think that's what we were talking about. And so it isn't, yes, it's hard because the advertising isn't there and won't be there for a while. And yes, it's hard because you have, I'm wrapping up here now, I'm bringing it all together. And yes, it's hard because you have this legacy business that you have to figure out. But if you start, it happens so much more quickly than you can ever imagine. It's spectacular. And if you don't start, you're never going to move to where you want to go. And that's the bottom line about disruptive technologies. Stop arguing and just do it is the bottom line.
All right,
that's
on
it.
That note.